Through the gunpowder smoke on the historical scene, a giant figure emerged. By liberating the country from isolation, Emperor Meiji transformed former samurais into a first-class army and built the most powerful fleet. Demonstrating the wonders of Japanese bravery and self-sacrifice to the world, first time in 500 years they forced Europeans to recognize Asians as their equal. As a result of total reforms aimed at rapid westernization, Japan converted from feudal fragmentation into a developed country with an industrial economy. By the end of the 19th century, the Japanese elite faced the issue of insufficient natural resources for the needs of a rapidly growing population. External expansion was the only solution to this problem. First, the Ryukyu state was conquered. On the island of Okinawa until the 19th century, there existed a semi-independent state that was a tributary of the Chinese emperor, and since 1609, it also recognized the suzerainty of the Satsuma prince. In 1879, a detachment of 300 Japanese soldiers landed on the island. Thus, Ryukyu was officially annexed by the Japanese Empire and transformed into Okinawa Prefecture. The annexation of Okinawa paved the way for the exploration of Pacific Islands. The next target of Japanese expansionists was Korea, which, like Ryukyu, was a vassal of Beijing. This time, by conquering Korea, the Japanese also wanted to avenge the failure in the Imjin War of the 17th century. Since Korea was not an independent state, the Japanese encountered the Chinese Empire. Hostilities began in 1894 when the Japanese landed on the peninsula. Korean fields became the battleground between the Chinese and Japanese imperial armies. Despite the fierce resistance of elite Chinese units, the more modernized Japanese army, which was built on the basis of Prussian and French models, won all the major battles and conquered the entire peninsula. The Japanese army then began to advance into China while simultaneously landing on the island of Taiwan. In April 1895, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki. As a result of this treaty, Korea was released from vassal dependency on Beijing, the Liaodong Peninsula and Taiwan came under Japanese control, and China was also obliged to pay a silver contribution equal to 1/3 of Japan's GDP. However, immediately after the treaty was signed, Russia, France, and Germany, in an ultimatum, demanded that Japan renounce the Liaodong Peninsula. Tokyo was forced to make concessions. The Liaodong Peninsula and its main city, Port Arthur, were crucial for Europeans, especially for Russia, as they first provided a strategic advantage for controlling southern Manchuria, and secondly, unlike Pacific ports, they did not freeze in winter. These concessions were perceived as a national humiliation by Japanese society. Thus, immediately after the end of the Sino-Japanese War, Japan began preparing for the Russo-Japanese War. In 1898, Russian Emperor Nicholas II signed a lease agreement with China for Port Arthur. In 1899, Chinese youth, discontent with their territories being handed over to foreign powers, rose up. In response, European countries and Japan intervened in China. In 1900, the Russian army crossed the border and occupied all of Manchuria. 2 years later, the uprising was suppressed, but the Russians delayed the withdrawal of troops, thereby threatening Japanese interests in Korea. At that time, the Korean imperial authorities saw Russia as a natural ally since they were powerless against the Japanese and believed that even the nominal Korean authorities' days were numbered. Realizing the inevitability of war, Japanese authorities began preparing for war against Russia. First, a military treaty was signed with the British Empire, obligating mutual assistance if either side was attacked by two countries together. This treaty deprived Russia of potential assistance from France or Germany. At that time, this event was not considered important, as Japan was not regarded as a serious military force by any European power, and it was assumed that Tokyo stood no chance against St. Petersburg. But the die was cast, and the war began on February 8, 1904. The Japanese blockaded the Russian Pacific Squadron at Port Arthur and, having landed troops, surrounded it. The Japanese wanted to capture the city and neutralize the fleet before the main parts of the Russian army arrived. The Russian naval forces consisted of three main fleets: the Pacific, Black Sea, and Baltic fleets. Their combined strength surpassed the Japanese fleet. However, the Japanese High Command planned to prevent the enemy forces from uniting and to defeat them individually. This was the main reason for the blockade of Port Arthur. Meanwhile, the Russians planned to break the blockade of the Eastern Fleet and move it north to take advantage of the freezing of the Japanese seaports in winter and wait for the arrival of the Baltic Fleet. For this purpose, an attempt was made in August 1904 to break the Japanese blockade and strike in the Yellow Sea. The outcome of the battle was inconclusive, and both sides returned to their starting positions, which meant a strategic victory for the Japanese. In January 1905, Port Arthur fell after an 11-month siege. Thus, securing its rear, the Japanese army began its offensive in southern Manchuria. By that time, the transfer of Russian troops to the Far East had been completed. The advancing Japanese army met the Russians near the Manchurian capital, Mukden. The battle for Mukden ended in a victory for the Japanese forces. Although the Russians began retreating, the losses incurred did not allow the Japanese army to advance deep into Siberia. By that time, the Baltic Fleet had arrived in the Far East. Japanese Admiral Togo met them near the Tsushima Islands, where 7 centuries ago, the Mongol armada of Khan Kublai was defeated. The Japanese fleet was superior to the enemy both qualitatively and numerically. In addition, the Russians were extremely exhausted after their long 1.5-year journey. However, there was no turning back. The last hope of the Russian emperor was destroyed under the thunder of Japanese ship guns. In July, the Japanese landed on Sakhalin. The military victories of Japan and the outbreak of the First Russian Revolution forced Emperor Nicholas to sue for peace. In Portsmouth, USA, a peace treaty was signed, as a result of which Manchuria was recognized as a zone of Japanese interests. Tokyo's authority over Korea was legitimized, and the island of Sakhalin was annexed to Japan. This victory was the first victory of Asian peoples over Europeans since the voyages of Magellan, and led to an increase in Japan's prestige in the eyes of the world community. In 1910, Korea, which was still formally a separate state, was annexed to Japan. The Korean emperor officially transferred his rights over Korea to the Japanese emperor. Thus, by annexing Korea, the new Japan was able to realize the millennial dream of the Japanese military intelligentsia. In 1912, Emperor Meiji passed away, and his son Yoshihito ascended to the chrysanthemum throne, continuing the policy of westernization of the country. In August of 1914, a major war broke out in Europe among the great powers. Japan sided with the Allies. As a result of brief combat operations, German bases on the Shandong Peninsula were occupied, and German possessions in the Pacific were captured. Under the Treaty of Versailles, these territories came under the control of the Japanese Empire. However, the proposal by the Japanese delegation to include an article on the equality of all races in the text of the treaty was rejected by the Europeans. This event led to a strengthening of Pan-Asian sentiments among the upper echelons of Japanese authorities. Japan thus began to wait for a convenient moment to completely eliminate the power of European colonizers in East Asia.